Hi everybody, my name is Raymond, and in March of this year I gave a level design focused talk to the Breda University of Applied Sciences. I'm really excited to be putting that online right now. It took me a while because there were some slight technical issues, but it looks like everything's sorted out now. So hopefully that's the case. And then without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Thank you guys so much for attending my guest lecture on motifing. Motifing is a level design tool you can use to create very gameplay focused levels. So obviously this is going to be a pretty level design heavy talk, but hopefully there will be something for if anybody who joins is not a level designer. This will help you get some insight into those pesky level designers you might have to work together with. So as is custom, I'm going to quickly introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Raymond Huiskamp. I'm a level designer at No Breaks Games here in Tenerife, and I have my own indie studio, Roofcat, with which I make my own indie projects. I graduated from Breda University in 2018, which was still called NHTV when I was studying there. Last year of which I did an internship at Sumo Digital, and they liked me enough to offer me a job, so I worked for them as a remote level design contractor. And I set up my own company, Roofcat, with which I made Warp Through and developed that and released that. And when Sackboy Big Adventure, which is what I was working on for Sumo Digital, when that was kind of coming to an end, I moved over to No Breaks Games in Tenerife, which is where I am now. To quickly outline what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to start with the basics, explain what I mean when I'm talking about a motif. And then because it is a tool, it can be relevant to your project to different degrees based on what you're making. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about using motifs to prove out gameplay, using motifs to build levels, and then I'm going to go quite in depth on essentially an example of a motifing process that you could use to create levels with. So starting off with the basics, what is a motif? If you've heard of the term motif before, you've probably heard of it in the context of one of these media, maybe as a leitmotif in a musical piece or as a visual or a narrative motif. And even though all of these names, a visual motif, reference to something different than a narrative motif, their definitions have a lot of overlap. They almost always refer to something that's a small element of a bigger whole. It's often recurring, and it often also has a metaphorical meaning. As we often do in the games industry, we ignore most of that. When I'm talking about a level motif, I'm mostly talking about a small section of a bigger whole. It could be recurring, could be metaphorical, but that's not inherent in something I call a motif. To give that a bit of a better definition, a level motif is a small piece of unique playable content. What exactly that is depends on what you are making, of course. It could be a single puzzle, it could be a short enemy encounter or a small platforming challenge, or really any of the gameplay that takes place within your game. Now that we know a little bit about what it is, to quickly address what it is not. So when I'm talking about a level motif, I'm not talking about a final piece of the level. I'm essentially talking about the draft version of a piece of gameplay that might essentially make it into the level later. Now, I'm also not talking about a gym to test metrics or a quick mechanic test. There really has to be some level design thought put into it so it can be a unique piece used again later in the level. So to show you a quick example of what that might look like, this top drawing would be the motif that you might make, which would eventually, after being selected, iterated upon, getting a lot of art and effects passes, would make it into the game, something like this. Quick disclaimer, this is not an actual motif that was used in Sackboy because I don't want to get sued. All right, now that we know a little bit about what motif is, let's talk about relevancy. So these are some of the games that were used, they were made using motifs. The term started at Media Molecule when they were making LittleBigPlanet, and then Sumo Digital adapted the term. They went on with it for LittleBigPlanet 3, and they used it for Sackboy: A Big Adventure, which is where I got used to the process. And Titanfall 2, interestingly, which seems like quite a different game, they also made use of a process that is very similar to motifing. They called it differently, but I'm going to be addressing that a little bit later. They used it in a very similar way as well. Now, these games, LittleBigPlanet and Titanfall, they seem quite different, but one thing that they really have in common is that they are very heavy on gameplay and level design. And that is exactly what motifing is very helpful, very useful for. Essentially, if you're making something like a logic puzzle game, a motif could be a puzzle room. If you're making platformers, it could be this platforming challenge that you use to make your level out of. And with action games, it could be a combat encounter, it could be a series of action events. Essentially, it works really well for moment-to-moment gameplay. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, that means it's less relevant for games that are not focused on moment-to-moment gameplay, like narrative games, like games that are really focused on some meta story or meta progress. You could, of course, still use motifs to, for example, try and figure out the gameplay in between narrative moments, or to figure out individual combat encounters in something like a deck builder game. But it is less something that you might integrate into the core building of your game. Whatever kind of project you're making, though, there are two situations where motifing can be extremely useful. The first one is when you are not entirely sure about a certain type of gameplay. You want to prove out that it works, either to yourself or to the rest of the team or your stakeholders. And secondly, when you are actually building a level and you want to start with these smaller pieces, build it up, starting with motifs. I'm going to talk about both of these, starting with using motifs to prove out your gameplay. So to quickly give you an idea of how you could use this, if you want to prove out a new type of gameplay for your game, you essentially first want to hack together any functionality that you might need. You might request it from your programmer, or if you are a little bit tech savvy, you can make it yourself. And then you just create and test numerous motifs. I'm going to go a lot more in depth on the actual creation process of motifs later. But essentially here, you just make a bunch of motifs, iterate on them, make new versions of them until it is clear that the type of gameplay you were thinking of making actually provides you with what you were looking for. And if you figure that out, then you probably also figured out a bunch of best practices. You figured out how to best set these things up and what kind of pitfalls there are with it. Or you might figure out that this type of gameplay doesn't actually work at all for your game. And either one of these answers is very good to know as soon as possible, because then you can move on with the rest of your development. So this is why it is extremely helpful. It helps you figure out whether a feature or a new mechanic, for example, is fruitful pretty early on. If you are introducing a new mechanic and you make a quick couple of motifs for it, you can see whether it has a nice variety in terms of gameplay possibilities. And if not, you might be able to pivot it. You might be able to change something that you're doing with that mechanic and make it provide you with those opportunities you were looking for. It also helps you to solve hard problems early on that you might not be able to do on paper or when you're still designing most of it in your head, such as problems with camera, problems with controls. Bless you, whoever that was. Please mute yourself. Such as problems with camera, problems with controls that are very difficult to figure out when you're still designing on paper. But when you're actually playing it, you can figure out that there's a lot of depth perception issues, or the player feels way too slow for this to feel fun. And lastly, it can actually be very helpful to provide clear expectation of what you as the level design team are expecting to use this mechanic like. If you've got an example, a couple of setups, then you can refer to those whenever the programmers want to know what your idea is with these type of mechanics. Same with artists or anyone else that wants to see what your goal is. You can use this obviously very early on in pre-production when you're actually proving out the core gameplay for your game. But you can also use this, as shown in the previous slide, whenever any new type of gameplay, new type of feature is introduced. Now that all might sound a lot like prototyping, and you're not necessarily wrong if you think that. It's just a very level design focused way of prototyping. It might not actually involve making any new technology. You might just use level design to essentially try and test out new gameplay types, new gameplay possibilities for your game. So coming back to Titanfall 2, they used a process that they called action blocking. And this is something that is extremely similar to Motifing, just a different name. And they have a GDC talk called Designing Unforgettable Titanfall Single Player Levels with Action Blocks. And I definitely recommend watching that if you are interested. They essentially use this to figure out what gameplay to pursue very early on and what to drop. So one of the examples that they gave is that they have these Titans, which are these massive robot exoskeletons that are piloted by humans, and they have the possibility to actually play as a human. And they wanted to test if in the single player campaign they could pit humans against Titans and see if there was any interesting gameplay they could get from that. And they figured out that there were so many things they would have to solve for that to work that it was just not feasible. And that was really great for them to figure out early, because that meant that they did not spend a whole lot of time in production constantly trying to make that work and then having to scrap it later anyway. All right, so we've talked a bit about using motifs to prove out gameplay. Let's use motif to build levels. Now, obviously, the level design process is different in any company you're in any project that you might be in. But essentially, it usually starts with you getting certain level requirements and then going into a preparation phase where you might do brainstorming. You might write out a level pitch document, draw a full 2D map of the level you're trying to make, or draw some flowcharts. And then you go into the grayboxing phase. You actually just start laying out the geometry, putting in gameplay, and playtesting it, iterating it, until eventually you get a nice outcome that you move on to to the art pass. And that is essentially the main chunk of level design that you do on your levels. With motifing, there's a couple of more steps involved. I'm going to go quite a lot in depth in these steps when I'm talking about the motifing process. But first, I think what's already interesting to see is that what you're really doing here is in the freeform motifing, in the focus motifing stage, you are making these individual chunks of gameplay, and you're already testing them in isolation, picking the best ones out of that. So by the time you come to the layout phase, you've really got, you've selected some really strong gameplay to actually make your level with. Now, a quote from my creative director, Jonathan Christian. He says, "For me, it's all about elemental design, being able to isolate and prove out gameplay before putting it into the bigger picture." And that is one of the main benefits of using motifing in your level design process. It kind of gets rid of the blank slate problem where you just have an empty scene and you don't really know exactly where to start, so you just put some blocks in and aren't sure where to put them. Using motifs helps you start with these small little chunks that you iterate on, that you figure out what works best, and then you build the level from that. Now, because you've got all of these chunks that have been tested in isolation and you've selected the best ones, your level is also going to be full of gameplay-focused content, and it's going to be fairly highly polished gameplay content. You've chosen the best. Motifing is also very helpful if you're trying to add specific content to a level. Let's say you're making an action game and you've got a lot of combat encounters already, but it's actually starting to feel a little bit still. It's a bit repetitive. So you want to add in some platforming sections, some puzzle sections perhaps. Motifing is a great way to just make a couple of these puzzle motifs or platforming motifs and see what fits in best into your level. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting but slightly counterintuitive of using motifs to build your levels is especially helpful for longer projects. While you are making your motifs, you're going to be not using all of those motifs that you made for a certain level right away in that level. But that's fine. You're trying to select the best ones and the ones that work very well for that particular level. But that doesn't mean that the motifs that you made are not good for another purpose. So that means that while you are working on all of these motifs, you essentially build up a library of cool gameplay for yourself to draw on later, because a motif that was not used in this level might be used in a later level, and that can be very helpful in the long run. And essentially all of the benefits that I noted for using motifs to prove out gameplay are things that you use when using motifs to build levels as well, because initially the first set of motifs you make prove out that gameplay and allow you to also pivot your mechanics in a way that better helps your level. Now, I'm not going to say that this is the perfect process and everybody should use it. For starters, it is a pretty lengthy process. Obviously, every time you add steps to a process, it's likely going to get longer. And as I said, there are going to be a lot of motifs that you will discard for a good reason, because you're selecting the best ones. But if you do not have a lot of time, or you're actually just not going to create a whole lot of content for your game, then the whole benefits of having this backlog of motif ideas is not going to help you, and it's just going to be a very lengthy process that might not work. The layout phase, which is where all the motifs are kind of put together and you make an actual gray box version out of these separate pieces, it feels very different than making a gray box from scratch. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but it's just something that's good to be aware of, because it feels very different. Instead of being free in wherever you make something, you are trying to really put these pieces in the right place. And the last one is not something that has to be a problem, but it's something that you really have to think about, which is that because you are working on a lot of these pieces in isolation and you are testing a lot of them in isolation, if you take too long to actually test them in a sequence, pace problems can take way too long to show up. So that's something that you just have to be mindful of when you are building your level design process, and when you're going through this, that whenever you kind of get to the point where you can test everything in a row, definitely do so. Okay, so all of that was warm up essentially for the motifing process. So now I'm going to go quite a lot in depth on these individual phases that you're going to go through as you go through this process. This is an example process, so obviously take what you can use from this, and your process might look quite different, but hopefully this will be useful. So as I'm going through this, I'm going to also be showing you an example project that I set up for this. It's going to be essentially, I'm going to make a level going through these steps as we're getting through it. So in order to explain to you what the level requirements for this particular example project are, it is a 2D top-down game in a grid-based dungeon. As you can see on the video over here, you can move in cardinal directions, up, down, left, right. And I want this level to introduce a particular enemy, this ogre over here, which has 2 attacks. It can smash around it, or it can do a directional attack, which reaches further, but obviously smashing around it has quite a wider area. So this is what I'm going to be making a level for, and I'm going to be coming back to this after every step. All right, so after you get your level requirements, the first step you're going to go through is the preparation phase. Now, for motifing, that's going to be motif brainstorming, and the goal here is really straightforward, just to get a big list of motif ideas, all sorts of different cool things you can do with the mechanics that you're thinking of using for your level. Depending on how big that list becomes, you might also want to have a selection of highlights to make sure that everybody knows what to focus on when they start creating their motifs. A couple of tips for this particular stage. It's very good to brainstorm in a small group if you have a small group of level designers, or you might even involve some of the programmers. And one way to kind of show to each other how you expect to use these mechanics, how you expect to create motifs out of it, is by drawing motifs and explaining them to the other people in that group. That really helps visualize how you expect to use these mechanics and make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page. Now, even if you're not showing them to anybody, it's still very helpful to draw motifs out, because it just gives you a nice reference, a little bit of spatialization for how you think this motif is going to work, and already allows you to maybe scrap some ideas that do not seem like they're working even on a paper. If you're trying to be very thorough, or if you just are kind of running out of ideas, you can use a mind map, or you can use a matrix, put down all of the mechanics and the dynamics that you're going to be having in this level, and see what kind of gameplay possibilities you can make out of that. So I did that for my example project. As you can see, I drew out a bunch of ideas on physical paper. I quite prefer doing this on physical paper because it helps me get less distracted by other things. And also, it's nice to sometimes have some time away from the screen when you're working on it all day. Now, some of the things I drew out here are that, for example, you can have some encounters with these monsters where you don't actually have to fight them. You just avoid them entirely. So they're more of either a blocker, or they're something kind of scary for you to avoid. In some situations, you do have to get so close that they will start attacking you, but you don't actually have to face them. You don't actually have to defeat them. And then I obviously made some motifs where you have to defeat the monsters. There I kind of made some distinction between having a wide open space where you can dodge all of their attacks, or a cramped space where you've only got this limited space to move. And I thought of one particular motif that I thought could be interesting, where you look ahead and you see how monsters are laid out. And then maybe you can use that knowledge when you pass there to go by there efficiently. All right, so I've got these all of these ideas drawn out, and then we go into the freeform motifing stage. The goal of this is really just to get a whole variety of level motifs that basically cover all of the things that we need in the level requirements. As it says over here, you can hack or request any functionality needed, and that even applies for making basically pivoting mechanics, or trying to make a different version of a mechanic, and just testing out how well that works. Now, one thing that's really good to do in this stage is to start simple. You may have some really good ideas that you've drawn out in your motif brainstorm, where, for example, you're making a level with lasers, and you've got 10 lasers you want spinning around in all different directions, going to be an awesome motif. Maybe just start with one laser and maybe just have it static, because that makes it, first of all, it gives you an easy win. It gives you an easy setup that you can complete, and finishing something is always very motivating. Lets you have something to show off, and that's already a great bonus. Secondly, if you've made this simple setup, then depending on what engine you use, you probably can copy it over and you reuse it when you're making a more complicated setup. So you've already done essentially a part of your more complicated motif and just save yourself a bunch of time. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this stage is that it's called freeform motifing because it's very, there's a lot of potential to be experimental about things. Functionality can be inconsistent here because you're just trying to look for what is most interesting for your level. You can see on the top right here, I drew that in one motif you might make a setup where someone can actually skate or slide on over a laser to get from one point to the other. And in another motif, you might have the laser just straight up kill the player. Now, obviously, this is inconsistent, and you might not want to do this. Your design brain might be saying, no, that's not how these kind of things work. But you're just trying to find the most interesting way to use certain mechanics in your level. So this is a very good thing to kind of keep an open mind and see, hey, maybe I can use this mechanic in a completely different way, and that will provide me with some cooler opportunities. Now, probably the biggest advice I can give you about the freeform motifing stage is not to be precious about your motifs. You're going to be throwing away about 90% of them, probably more. And so it's very important that you don't get too attached to it. You try something out, and if it seems good but not good enough, make a different version of it. If it doesn't seem good, try something completely different. Now, because you're going to be making a lot and you're going to be throwing away a bunch of them, obviously you want to be efficient. So limit your art, limit how much time you spend making it all look really good. But depending on your game, you might still want to add some context. For example, if you're making a game that's based in a world that has realistic physics, you might want to, for example, as you see over here, instead of using floating boxes, you might want to use pipes to show how you want these platforms to be laid out. Because that can really help you when you start to get to a layout phase, when you start to actually place these things in the right location, because that helps you kind of keep in mind how they're supposed to be connected to the ground, how these things are supposed to be actually working in the final version. Then something that's really helpful if you are testing it out with your colleagues is to add start and end markers. Now, this can literally just be some text that says start, some text that says end, because if you're making these small motifs, it's not necessarily clear to anyone that loads up the level where they're supposed to begin this motif. And it's very important that that is clear because you want to playtest and review these motifs regularly. You're already in a very good place because this is already something playable. It's already a perfect time to see if players, potentially other designers, but even better if you pick someone from the team that maybe isn't as good at the game, you already start catching these potential problems with your motifs, potential problems with systems that you're using. So that's really helpful to do pretty early on. There's already quite a lot of things that you can consider at this stage. Obviously, you want to keep in mind that you're trying to be very efficient with making these motifs. So you can use metrics and skill, and obviously it's very good to already have some prefabs, some quick things you can use as a template for the perfect jump or the perfect unattainable jump. That's already good to keep in mind. Affordances, readability, and shape language are also really good to kind of keep in mind, at least at the back of your head. And especially when it comes to the mechanics that you're using in these levels, because this is potentially, depending on your process, this might be the first time that those mechanics are used in an actual playable situation. So if it turns out that players are playing it and they're not interacting with these mechanics that you've made or that the program's made in the way that they're supposed to be, then this is the right time to address that and to figure out how to make sure that all of that is clear enough to continue with. All right, so I did that for my example project. I made a couple of motifs here on the left that are all about avoiding monsters entirely. So all of these can be done without getting close enough to a monster for it to attack. Then I made some motifs here in the middle where I have basically you always get close enough for a monster that you will be triggering its attack, but you don't have to actually fight any of them. You don't have to actually defeat them in order to continue. And you can see that these top ones I made are already iterations of the lower ones that are essentially just a worked out version of that idea. And then here on the right, I've made some motifs where you have to actually defeat certain monsters. And yeah, that's just the three different gameplay types that I kind of went for. One thing that's already good to know, and this bears repeating, is that it's very helpful to just keep playing this as you are making them, because I see this in the view you see on the right. This is how I make the levels. But if I go into the gameplay camera, you can see that you can actually only barely see the legs of the upper monster that I've got over there. And the whole idea of this motif is that you can look ahead and see where monsters are laid out. So this might still work fine, but if I wanted any more monsters above this, then this whole idea of looking ahead and seeing how these monsters are laid out, it doesn't work. And obviously this is just a 2D game where all that really matters is how close you get to it. But if you're working on a 3D game, especially where the player can adjust the camera, then it's very important to test it a lot with the gameplay camera and see whether certain things just completely are out of sight or don't work in this particular setup. All right, so now that we've made a bunch of motifs, we're going to go select and review them. Now, I've not made a specific stage for it because this is essentially just the end of freeform motifing, but it's quite important, and that's why I thought I would address this separately. So your goal here is to try and create a list of motifs to continue with. Obviously, you want to have feedback on those motifs to figure out how to make them work as best as possible. And you want to have a list of missing elements. So this could be missing gameplay or entire missing motifs. Now, in order to do this, I would advise that everybody that is going to be part of this, this reviewing process plays the actual relevant motifs and then starts selecting them. And you can either select them individually and then come together later, or you can all sit around someone that is playing and then just kind of decide as you are going through it. You want to select based on the quality of the individual motifs, but also on the needs for the level, which I'll come into in a second. Then you want to review everything together and really discuss how is the player going to progress through all of these motifs, in what order are they going to be, and what are we still missing. So I said you're going to want to basically pick motifs based on how good they are, but also on what the level needs, because you're going to need to keep a lot of things in mind. For example, progression. You don't want to just pick all of these really cool motifs that are all very complex, because you're probably going to want to start it off with some lighter gameplay encounters. Diversity is important. If you've got 3 mechanics that you want to use in this level and all the motifs you've picked are from this one mechanic, either that's going to get really repetitive, or at least it's going to mean that the other mechanics you've got in mind are going to be underused. So try and pick a nice variety of mechanics. And here it is good to start thinking about consistency. As I said, in the freeform motifing stage, it is fine to still, have mechanics act wildly different in different motifs because you're just trying to figure out what works best. But here it's good to start thinking about how they can all work together, either as completely different mechanics, or see if they can just use the same mechanics and just adjust the motifs to be able to do that. Now, something that's good to keep in mind is that motifs are pretty cheap to make, but working them out is probably not. So if you've made 30 motifs and 20 of them seem really awesome and you want to use all of them, keep in mind that there's going to be a lot of art that's going to be needed to put in that animation. The programmers are going to need to find the hacky corner cases that you've put into your motifs. And that's all just going to cost a lot of time to make. And on top of that, you might actually end up making a really way too long level. So try and pick a set of motifs that will allow you to make a nice polished level that basically you have the time to create. So I did that. I selected a couple of the motifs from the set that I made. I really like that here at the top. It kind of feels like you're sneaking by these monsters. Here I really like that. I kind of like a combination of them, but what I really like about this one is that the monster doesn't have these walls next to it, which makes it feel a lot more dangerous when you're walking past it, even though you don't have to trigger it at all. I really like this shape because the shape is kind of the perfect radius of its area attack, and then the perfect length of its longer directional attack. So that means that you really have to read its tail and figure out how to dodge it. Here it's just nice to have 2 different ways, different paths that also feel quite significantly different. And then for the setup with actually defeating monsters, I chose this one because it's just a very straightforward open space where you can defeat a monster. And this one because basically comparing it to this one where the corridor is a little bit less wide. Here you've got a bit more space to move around, which means you've got more space to avoid enemy attacks, but also actually means you've got more space to make mistakes, which is nice. All right, so after we've gone through that whole selection process and we've got all the feedback, we've got all the things that we want to focus on, we're going to look at focus motifing. And the whole idea of this stage is really just to get all of the motifs, all of the sections that we need in order to fully make this level. Now, there's something that's not really clear in this diagram I made on the bottom right. which is that focus motifing essentially overlaps or maybe even starts at the same time as your layout phase, because you're going to go back and forth a lot. You're going to be basically making these new motifs and then stepping back, seeing what they look like in the overall layout, whether everything still works. Now, this is a point where you want to enforce consistency. As I said earlier, you will probably have selected a couple of mechanics that all really work well together. But if one of those mechanics has to behave differently in order for a certain motif to work, you want to make sure that's extremely clear to the player. It's very readable why it behaves differently, or you just avoid it. You make sure that the mechanics always work in the same way. Pretty straightforward. You want to ensure everything is introduced well. This may mean making some additional motifs to try and make sure that motifs that are more complicated are first introduced. You first introduce the mechanics in them in individual isolated sections. And again, you test the individual motifs, but you also really want to test everything in a row. And that's kind of where, going back and forth between the layout phase and the focus motifing is very relevant. So a lot of things you can already start to consider. Because you already kind of know the progression, it's good to start thinking about the mood and the feeling that the player might have as they go through these motifs. So you might want them to feel a little bit closed in, claustrophobic, and then come out with a moment of catharsis near the end. It's good to start thinking about intentionality. Are your goals clear? Do the player actually know where to go? And if not, is that okay? At this point, it's also good because you know all the motifs that you want to use. You can think about whether some of these motifs might use the same space or whether they might reuse the same objects, which will make everything feel just a lot more connected. And it's good to start thinking about areas that are just required in your level, because you might have a certain entrance that every level has. You might have certain story beats that you need to hit in this level, and any other potential required areas that you might encounter. So I did that. I looked at the set of motifs that I selected in the review process, and then I figured out what I was still missing. One of the things I felt like I was still really missing was a sense of having things connect, having things feel like they are a bigger space. So I made this lower left motif where you can look ahead, not at something that you're going to do in a couple of seconds, but at a later motif that you're going to encounter later on in the level. I started thinking about making shortcuts. So here the idea is that normally you could just move right on, ignore these monsters over here, but later on you might get back and use this as a shortcut. And this is also roughly where I started realizing that a lot of the gameplay possibilities I've thought of do not involve you actually killing any of these ogres. So maybe I'll just have you obtain the weapon later. That means that I can use, for example, this shortcut as something that you actually can't pass until you get the sword, and then you can go through it. Now, obviously, that's not something completely novel. That's something that a bunch of games do, but for a reason, it's quite nice to get it halfway through a level. However, I'm just working in a level designer, so I'm not actually changing the functionality to stop you from being able to attack. So what I set up is just this button, and once you get to the button, you're basically allowed to attack as a player. And when you get here, a monster is going to spawn right behind you, and that will immediately introduce you to having to fight monsters and basically knowing how to do so. Now, I also figured out that from the selection I made, there's actually not a lot of interesting fighting setups I've got, not a lot of interesting situations where you actually have to defeat a monster. So I made some more. And I also figured out I wanted to add in an optional objective. I wanted to add in this loot that you can get. And I kind of revived one of the earlier motifs I made, which I thought was way too hard, because it's fine if it's a little bit hard for an optional objective. All right, now the layout phase. This is essentially, it's just a final phase. It's where you're going to put everything together, and you're going to want to have the result be a fully playable version of the level with the layout finalized, everything feeling like a cohesive space. It essentially is the same result you would get out of a gray box, just it's gone through a different process. Now, we would generally start with something we called a smash together, which is essentially just you grab the first motif and then connect up the exit from the first motif to the entrance of the next motif. And it's just very straightforward, making sure that everything can be played in a row. That already gives you an idea of how everything will feel together. And then you start moving stuff around, you start moving the motifs around, trying to make it into an interesting shape of a level, keeping a lot of things in mind. iterate on it, improve the individual spaces, make everything work well, and then end up with a really cool gray box in the end. Now, again, I'm going to keep repeating this because it's really important not to mess up on this. I'm mostly saying this because we did. It's good to test spacing and flow early. So this all smashed together. You might already be able to make that very soon after you're done with the freeform motifing stage, because you've selected how you want, which motifs you want to use in your level, how you want to progress through them. You can already connect them up, and that really shows you very clearly where problems are with pace and with the flow. When you're actually making this layout, it can feel quite constraining when you are moving around these chunks that hopefully, if everybody's limited their art, don't have a lot of art, but still have a bunch of gameplay functionality in it. So you might, instead of moving around the entire motifs, you might just want to replace it with a couple of cubes that kind of roughly block out, this is the space that this motif needs. That allows you to just very simply move things around. It might also help your editor not freeze every time you move something. Yeah, and that just kind of gives your head some room to be like, all right, it's fine if this intersects a little bit with this, because it's fine, I'll fix it later. And that's also something that's good to know. At this point, breaking everything is pretty much fine, because you're going to be going through it and fixing it up later. So as long as you basically you have the space that I can make this motif work within the space, it's fine if it doesn't work right now. You just want to get a good looking level and a good feeling connection between all of them. You probably want to try some different versions. Usually the first version that you try, you might feel very confident about it, but it might not be the final one. So if you made something that looks like a hill, maybe try and make something that looks like a valley. See if there's any more interesting things that come out of just trying some different shapes. Just gives you some different options to choose from. And lastly, this is also something that you can use in any of the other states, but designers can take over from each other. If someone gets really stuck thinking that, oh, I've made this layout where you start with this and then it has to do this, and then you basically get this whole idea about everything being designed for this purpose. And if something doesn't work, you might feel like, I can't take that out because that's the setup for this next motif. And you can get really locked into that mindset, and it's very difficult to get out of sometimes. So you might want to ask any of the other designers on your team to take over, or just have a little brainstorm with them and see if they have some good thoughts on how you might switch things around and make things work. At this point, you're essentially considering everything. You are thinking of landmarks, vantage points, making sure you have some nice views as you get through the level, thinking of loops and shortcuts to make everything feel connected. You're thinking of using all the tools to guide the player if you want to make sure that the player knows where to go. Think of your golden and your optimal path to make sure that you have a good sense of your own level. And essentially everything that you might normally do in a gray box, you want to consider in this layout phase. And that brings us to the outcome of my little example project. So I made this little layout. I'm actually quite happy with how it feels like a space. It doesn't just feel like a linear path that you're doing. And you might still recognize a bunch of the individual motifs. If you don't, here they are. But even though you recognize them, they have been altered quite a bit. A bunch of them have rotated. These yellow ones, as you see over here, have been merged into one. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want, because we essentially made these motifs as core gameplay sections that we really wanted to bring to life. And we can adjust the spacing, the geometry. That's not the core of these motifs. We actually just put them all together in here and make a cool level out of it. So to quickly show you playing through it. So first you're going to have this whole dodging section. You're going to go through all of that without having to actually feed any monsters. Then over there you get to fight some of the monsters, get the shortcut. I'm quite happy with the shortcut because that makes it feel more like this is really a space that's connected up in different ways. But you could actually also just go around the shortcut the way that you came. Here you get back to the beginning. You fight the monster over here. Here you could go for the optional achievement, but I did not go for that because I did not want to die that much, and I was already dying quite a lot at the end there with the final fight. That's essentially that is the outcome from taking this these quite simple requirements through this motifing process. And what's kind of fun to see is that you probably don't recognize this picture, but I showed it in one of the earlier slides. And I did actually make this picture with the rough goal in mind to have a nice level. And I just didn't really know where to start, because I was like, I just want something that looks like a level. I want it to feel like it has these cool little moments. But if you look at it, it's shit. You have one encounter where you're going to dodge an enemy, and then most of the time you're just fighting them. I even introduced another mechanic because I didn't think that having these monsters would be enough. Now, obviously, this took less than 5 minutes. This took probably a couple of hours. So there's a big difference in quality. That's not just the motifing process, but the motifing process really helped kind of guide me make an interesting level out of this. Even though they're pretty simple mechanics, it's a pretty simple setup. So after all of that, you're going to go onto the art pass, and this is kind of the same as you would do in any gray box that you've made. You want to help make sure that the artists understand your designs and make them into wonderful levels without breaking all of the cool ideas you had for this level. And that is the general motifing process that I, in some ways, have been using. Again, this is an example. This does not mean that you have to use this directly, but yeah, hopefully this gives you kind of a starting point if you want to use motifs. And you can even use this to use motifs basically to prove out gameplay and just adapt some of this. And that was it. Thank you so much for attending my my guest lecture on motifing.